Number 1. Tree. I remember this happening to me back when I was a pre-teenager. I think I was 12 at the time, before we called people that age tweens. I've noticed lately that a lot of people seem to think that 11 and 12-year-olds are just the faces of innocence, but nothing could be further from the truth. Especially when I was that old, I knew the boys were just as bad, if not worse, than the boys that were older than them. I really wasn't like all the other boys at that early of an age, although I have to admit to getting that way later on. However, when I was 12 years old, I really wasn't interested in a lot of the things the other boys were interested in. More often than not, I just wanted to be left alone. Being left alone was not the best available option when I went to summer camp, though. I also had no interest in going there either, but my parents insisted that I did. I had gone several times as a younger boy, and liked it more when I was younger, but I felt that I had outgrown it, and I really had no interest in going back. But I guess my parents probably thought that they needed the extra time to themselves during the summer break, so I had to go, even though I didn't want to. It was a pain in the ass, really. Summer was supposed to be my time away from all the BS that I had to put up with at school. Although I was a good student, I really didn't like being around all the other kids. Most of the time they just annoyed me. I wasn't bullied or anything like that, so I wasn't one of those kids who was alone because I had no choice but to be. I just really didn't like many people. They always got on my nerves, and I was much happier when I was nowhere near them. So camp just seemed like a really lame way to spend part of my precious summer break. I guess the only good thing about it, really, was that the camp was far enough away from home, and was attended by people from all over, that I never ran into anyone from my own school while I was there. However, most of the kids attending the camp were repeat attenders, so I knew plenty of them from year to year. My wanting to be alone was a pretty recent development. In the past, I had gotten a lot more into the camp thing. The counselors knew me, and there were plenty of other boys who knew me too, and hung out with me in previous years. Arriving this year, I could tell that a lot of them had been looking forward to seeing me. I tried to be friendly enough to not seem like I was being a jerk, but I didn't feel much like socializing with anyone. A little bit more than a week into camp, I was just not having the best time. I had a hard time sleeping one night, much preferring to have been home in the air conditioning and reading a book. So although I was not supposed to do so, I decided to get up and go for a walk. Fortunately, the counselor who slept in my cabin slept like a log, so I was able to get up and leave the cabin without him having known any different. When I came back, I knew he would still be snoring his head off, much like he was right then. God, it was pretty hot for what I was able to tolerate, and I knew that I wouldn't be getting much sleep no matter how tired I was. So I decided I was just going to walk around endlessly. I didn't pay attention much to where I was going either. I had been in those woods plenty of times before in my life, and even in the dark, I had no fear of getting lost. I'm not sure how long I'd been out there before I started hearing the noise. I wasn't sure what it was, but it concerned me right away. It didn't sound human, and the last thing I needed was to encounter something non-human out there. Hell, I didn't really want to encounter something human out there either, unless I was lucky and it was someone that I knew from camp. I was still young enough to believe those maniac in the woods stories that they tell around the campfire. So thinking about those possible human and non-human encounters really got me a bit nervous. I didn't have any idea what the noise I kept hearing was, but it didn't sound good. And since my imagination was then beginning to get the better of me, I decided it was best to try and head back to camp. It's better to be unable to sleep while I am in bed than it is to be walking around and coming across who knew what. I wasn't sure what to do, and I can't tell you why I thought to even do this, but I stopped as I was hurrying back to the camp. I felt very uneasy, and I really wanted to get back, but something was telling me that I would never make it back to the camp. It was dark, but it wasn't too difficult to see, since my eyes had been adjusted for quite a while. I found a tree that looked like it was easy enough to climb, and decided to climb my way up it. I thought I could get a better look around if I did so. It wasn't long after I climbed up the tree before I was very grateful that I did so. There was some sort of animal walking around and was really close to the tree. I had to squint my eyes a little to try and make it out better, but when I did, I was pretty shocked at what I saw. It looked like a medium-sized wolf was roaming around at the base of the tree. I thought to myself that the wolf must have been the noise that I was hearing. I didn't know what to do. I knew very little about wolves. All I did know was, ironically, what they told us at camp. But I didn't know if I was in danger or anything. Hell, I didn't even know if wolves can climb trees or not. So I decided that despite the fact that I was really scared, I had to try and stay as quiet as I could. Plus, I didn't know if this was the only wolf out there, or if it was part of a pack that was doing some night hunting. The wolf came and went a little bit as I remained up in the tree. However, it was never gone very long, and it never really went very far away. There was no point in which I felt that I could climb down the tree and be safe to make it back to camp. It got very difficult at times, holding myself up against the tree, but I was just very determined to do so. I was up in that tree for a very long time. At no point was I ever sure whether or not the wolf even knew that I was there, but he never strayed far. After a while, I found myself getting very, very sleepy up in that tree, but the worst thing that could have happened was for me to fall asleep and fall out of the damn tree. After a bit of time, I realized I hadn't seen the wolf come back for a while after the last time he had gone out of view. It seemed like it might be a good time to get down out of the tree and try to make it back to camp, but I was too terrified still to even try anything like that. I just stayed up in the tree all night, waiting to see if the wolf would come back or not. The sun eventually began to come up without the wolf coming back. It wasn't until then, when I was able to see better around me, that I decided to try and climb down and make it back to camp. Even then it was scary to do so. My brain was overly tired from not getting any sleep at all during the night, and I wasn't fully in charge of my faculties, so I was jumping at every noise, thinking that the wolf or his pack was after me. I made it back into camp before anyone woke up. I was able to crawl into bed and pretend like I had been there all night. I pretended to be sick that day in order to remain in bed and get some rest. It was the last time I ever wandered into the woods in the middle of the night. Number 2. Grandma's house. My grandma lived in this big house out in the country. I always loved visiting there when I was younger, because it was a much different atmosphere than I was used to. Although it definitely didn't compare to the country houses that the very rich had, it was still a really big and nice house. I often wondered how my grandma lived in such a big house by herself. But she had been there as long as I knew, and she seemed to be really happy out there. I can't explain a whole lot about the house. I'm just not really that descriptive of a writer. But just to know, it didn't have air conditioning in it, but it actually never even needed it. During the summertime, my grandma would keep all the windows open in the house. On almost any day then, the breeze would carry through the whole house, keeping it really, really cool. It was nearly as good, and sometimes even better than air conditioning. The house had 3 stories, which didn't include the attic and the fruit cellar. There were tons of bedrooms, so when relatives came to visit, there was always room. Plus there were rooms that I had never been in before. I always remember, and I will always love that big house. However, there was one summer when I didn't have the best time there. I was pretty young at the time, but I can't tell you exactly how young, but it was still young enough to have an active imagination, which I realize that could have an effect on how I perceive things. Being out in the country and being in that big house could open your mind up to many possibilities, especially when you were a kid. This summer I was spending a week at my grandma's house by myself. I always liked sleeping in a certain room on the second floor of the house. I rarely ever went up on the third floor of the house, but out of a lack of much else to do, I did go exploring in that area during this week. I even went up into the attic and looked around in there. There wasn't really much interesting in there though, just a bunch of boxes and storage. But it was very strange and creepy up in the attic, and that itself put me in a bit of a imaginative mood. I don't really feel like it's related, but I mention my exploring because the strange thing that happened to me just happened to occur on the night of that day that I went into the new parts of the house. I was in bed, trying to go to sleep, in the room that I always slept in and I was very comfortable with. The window was open and the door was propped open as well. There was a really nice, cool breeze going through the house. The wind was a little loud, so the first time I heard something, I barely heard it. But it sounded like someone was groaning outside of the house. First I just chalked it up to the wind and tried to leave it at that. However, I could still hear it. A few times the noise came in through the window, and each time it seemed less and less like it was the wind. I finally knew that it couldn't be the wind because I heard someone distinctly moaning for help. No one lived close to Grandma's house, so it couldn't have been a neighbor or anything. There was also no reason for anyone to be in her yard, and they would have to be in order for me to have heard them. But there was a second time that I heard someone call for help, and I decided that I had to go over to the window and check it out. Of course I was nervous getting up. I was downright scared if I am being honest. But I crept out to the window, keeping myself hidden so whoever might be out there couldn't see me. When I got there, I peered out the window and didn't see anything at first. However, I heard someone calling for help again. I tried to locate where the voice was coming from. It was difficult to do this and keep myself hidden from view at the same time. However, I did manage to do it. It was very dark outside, but I could see pretty good. But I still didn't see anyone in the yard, much less someone that was in need of any help. I waited by the window just watching. I waited for someone to yell for help again, but I didn't hear them do it. I was ready to chalk it all up to my imagination and go back to bed, but then I saw something that shocked me. Some person, who appeared completely able-bodied, appeared briefly from behind a tree. He looked up in my direction, probably didn't see me, and then hid himself behind the tree again. He then called for help again. I moved back from the window and went out of my room to wake my grandma up and tell her what I had seen. I thought that the man out there must have been up to something, and not something very good. My grandma did something I will never forget to this day. She grabbed her rifle and went down to the front door of the house. She opened the door and fired the rifle into the air and said, "There's another one for you if you don't get the hell off of my property." I wasn't in my room, but I bet if I had been, I would have seen that guy running away after my grandma fired that shot. I definitely saw it in my mind. I slept in my grandma's room that night because I was still pretty shaken up about the whole thing, but my grandma was a hunter, and I knew she was really good with her rifle. I felt protected. Later she told me that she saw the guy running off into the woods. I wish I had seen him running from my grandma too. Number 3. Truck Drive. I'm sorry ahead of time if you don't find this story scary. More than anything, you'll probably just get angry about it. But the story was very terrifying to me when it originally happened. When I was like 11 years old, me, a couple of my cousins that were my age, were hanging out at my grandparents' house with our family. My grandparents had 2 teenage sons who were the youngest members of their family. Many times, when we were there, they made my uncles watch over us, and it wasn't their favorite thing to do. They had to find ways to entertain themselves, and usually it was by doing things that were not as entertaining to us. On this night, they gave my uncles some money and had them drive us into town to get some sodas. My 2 cousins and I rode in the back of the truck while my uncles were in the cab. After we got our drinks in town, we all rode back into the hills. But my uncles didn't want to go home right away, so they decided to drive out into the hills, down all the twisting and turning dirt roads. They had a window that opened up in the back of the cab, and they told us that they were going to go and check out a house that supposedly a murderous old hermit lived in. The 3 of us immediately got a little scared, but we pretended like we weren't. While we were driving, my one uncle kept telling us that the hermit liked to get young boys, and he would tie them up in the house and torture them before killing them. Eventually, the truck turned into a driveway. We saw a really dark house at the end of the driveway. We begged them not to drive up to the house, and they didn't. However, they did turn the truck off while we sat there, and their lights shined on the house. One of my cousins told us that he thought my uncles were just messing with us, that no one probably even lived in the house. But no sooner did he say this, but the porch light came on. We saw the front door open, and an older man came out on the porch. My uncle tried to start the truck up, but couldn't get it to start. The man walked off the porch and began walking to the truck. My uncle kept telling us that he couldn't get the truck started. All 3 of us began freaking out as the old man kept walking up to the truck. My other uncle suggested that they give the 3 of us up to the old hermit, and maybe he would let my uncles go. This, of course, got the 3 of us scared and on the verge of tears. Before the guy made it to the truck, however, they finally started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and then took off down the road. We watched as the old guy stopped, and simply watched us as they drove the truck away. We found out later the whole thing was just them trying to scare us. They knew the old guy, and had called him on the phone from the store earlier. They all agreed to the prank. The failure to start the truck was also fake. It was just to scare us 3 cousins. There is a good outcome to the story, though. When we told Grandpa what happened, he made my uncles go cut him a couple of switches, which he then used on them right in front of us. That almost made up for it. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. First thing I want to talk about is I did start a Patreon. A lot of people have asked me to do this over the years, and I've always resisted it, but I decided to go ahead and start one, and the link for it will be in the description. The Patreon itself is not going to really affect my channel. I have had some people express concern that I'll be doing everything for pay over on Patreon and not be doing content here, and that won't be happening. In fact, one of the reasons I started the Patreon was to help me have more free content here. If you can't afford to buy a tier for the Patreon, there also is a free membership there. You can sign up for the free membership and there'll be posts and cat pictures and stuff like that. But again, this will be done in addition to everything I do here, and I do hope that I'll have much more content here in the future than I have had lately. So please sign up if you can, even if it's just a free account. I'd love to see you there. In the meantime, if you like this video, please give me a like, and subscribe and hit the bell if you haven't already done so. This way you'll get notified of any new content here. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think of the video, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd want narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. Other than that, the most important thing is, please don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.